try to keep something between you and your target.
He was the quiet force behind one of television's most rugged survival shows, a man who needed no words to prove his grit, and then almost without warning he vanished. Tom Oar, the legendary frontiersman of History Channel's Mountain Men, captivated millions with his stoic presence, ancient skills, and an unwavering dedication to a life few dared to even imagine. But in recent years, fans began to notice something unsettling. Tom was appearing less frequently than not at all. The man who once weathered blizzards, tanned hides in sub-zero temperatures, and stared down apex predators was suddenly missing from the narrative, and viewers were left wondering what could possibly take down a man who had seemingly conquered nature itself. Was it illness? Was there a falling out behind the scenes? Or had the very wilderness he embraced turned on him in a cruel twist of fate? Whispers of a tragic accident began to circulate. Then came the rumors. Online obituaries, health scares, speculation about money troubles or something more ominous. Yet through it all, one thing remained clear. The silence surrounding Tom's disappearance was deafening. This wasn't just a man stepping away from fame, it was a wilderness legend retreating into the shadows, and the true story of why would stun even his most loyal followers. What unfolded behind the scenes wasn't just a matter of aging out of the spotlight. It was a deeply personal reckoning with pain, fear, and the haunting realization that even the strongest mountain man can be brought to his knees. But before we reveal the painful truth behind his disappearance, we have to start at the very beginning, before the show, before the mountains, before the fall. Because to understand Tom Oar's quiet exit, you first have to understand the raw, unforgiving life he chose to live, and why he was willing to give it all up in the end. Long before Tom Oar became synonymous with survival in the wilderness, he was chasing a different kind of danger, one that came with roaring crowds, snorting broncos, and the split-second chaos of the rodeo circuit. Born in 1943 in Rockford, Illinois, Tom wasn't raised in the wild, but the wild was always waiting for him. His father, Chico Oar, had once performed in the iconic Wild West shows of the late 1800s and early 1900s, a living embodiment of frontier grit. That legacy didn't just hang on the wall in the form of cowboy hats and old photographs, it coursed through Tom's veins. By the time he was a young man, he had saddled up and stepped into the unforgiving world of professional bronc riding, a sport that punished weakness and demanded total commitment. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Tom became a fixture in rodeo arenas across the country, climbing the ranks of the International Rodeo Association and earning a name as a fearless rider. But glory came at a cost. Every ride was a gamble against gravity and bone. Tom was thrown, trampled, and broken more times than he could count, and each time he got up, patched himself together, and climbed back on. It was a brutal rhythm, and no matter how much he loved the adrenaline, the wear and tear on his body was undeniable. The turning point came on Valentine's Day 1970, during what would become the most harrowing ride of his career. Mounted on a massive bull known as Woolly Bugger, Tom was thrown violently in the chute. His skull slammed against the animal's head, rendering him unconscious and trapping his hand in the rope as the bull bucked relentlessly with Tom beneath it. For 2 agonizing minutes, his body was trampled and battered, as horrified onlookers, including his wife Nancy, watched helplessly. Tom was rushed out on a stretcher and remained unconscious for 3 hours, sustaining severe bruises and a concussion. Though he returned to the arena just a month later, the fall had changed something in him. He was still breathing, but the fire had dimmed. The pain lingered longer. The recovery was slower. The dream that once felt invincible now felt borrowed. That moment in the dirt didn't just end a ride, it ended a chapter. And without knowing it, Tom was already being called somewhere else, not by the roar of the crowd, but by the silence of the wilderness. By the early 1980s, Tom Oar had seen enough of the rodeo's dust, blood, and broken bones to know his body couldn't take another fall. The roar of the crowds had grown faint, replaced by an internal calling that grew louder with every aching joint and sleepless night. So in 1981, with his beloved wife Nancy by his side, Tom made a decision that would bewilder most and inspire thousands. He walked away from the arena and straight into one of the harshest corners of the American wilderness, the remote Yaak Valley in northwestern Montana. It wasn't a weekend retreat or a scenic vacation, it was a complete, unapologetic reset. There were no neighbors for miles, no cell service, no backup plan, just dense forests, snow-laden hills, and silence so deep it could drive an unprepared man mad. Winters routinely plunged 30 degrees below zero. Snowfall blanketed everything, cutting them off from even the smallest traces of civilization. Groceries weren't an option. Electricity didn't exist. Water came from rivers and melted snow. It was survival in its purest form, and Tom embraced it like he had finally come home. Together he and Nancy built their life from the ground up. They chopped their own firewood, hunted their own food, and learned to live in rhythm with the seasons. Every task was a matter of survival. Every success, even something as small as starting a fire or fixing a tool, was a victory earned through sweat and persistence. Most people wouldn't last a week in that kind of isolation. But for Tom, it was liberating. There was no crowd to impress, no competition to win, just the steady, honest work of staying alive. In the shadow of snow-capped peaks and under the watchful eye of wolves and bears, Tom found something far more profound than applause: peace. And as the years passed and his beard grew long and silver, a new identity emerged. Not as a former rodeo rider, but as a mountain man, forging a new legacy with his own two hands. The wilderness didn't just offer refuge, it offered redemption. In the heart of the Montana wilderness, far beyond the grasp of modern convenience, Tom Oar began to transform, not just in lifestyle, but in spirit. He wasn't merely surviving in the mountains, he was mastering them. Over time, Tom became a walking embodiment of forgotten knowledge, a modern man living by ancient rules. Each day brought new tests, but also new lessons. While most people today rely on store-bought goods and digital shortcuts, Tom taught himself to do everything by hand, from crafting his own tools to preserving meat without refrigeration. His greatest passion, however, became hide tanning, the traditional, painstaking process of turning animal skins into wearable leather using smoke, manual scraping, and natural materials. With no formal training, Tom studied the old ways, mimicking the techniques of Native Americans and frontier pioneers. He would trap animals in the snow, skin them in the stillness of the forest, and spend days perfecting the tan until each pelt was soft, durable, and beautifully finished. He turned those hides into clothing, moccasins, gear, and blankets, not just functional pieces, but artifacts of a vanishing world. While others looked at tanned leather as fashion, Tom saw it as survival. And it wasn't just about the work, it was about a philosophy: waste nothing, take only what you need, and honor every piece of nature you use. His hands became calloused with purpose, and every cut of the blade was a tribute to the life he chose. Nancy, ever the quiet force beside him, matched his rhythm with her own strength. She managed the household, assisted with hide preparation, sewed garments, and kept wildlife at bay when necessary. Together they formed a partnership as solid as the log walls of their cabin. There were no dramatic speeches, no declarations of love, just the shared rhythm of a life earned through grit. Word of Tom's craftsmanship began to spread. Locals spoke of the man who lived off-grid and made everything by hand. Visitors, intrigued by the mystique, traveled miles just to meet him. But Tom wasn't selling a lifestyle, he was simply living one. And in every tanned hide and handmade tool, there was a piece of his story, one of endurance, humility, and complete authenticity. He wasn't trying to become a legend, he just never stopped being real. By the time the cameras finally found Tom Oar, he had already lived a dozen lifetimes of hardship, triumph, and self-reliance. But in 2012, that quiet life took an unexpected turn when producers from the History Channel arrived with a proposition. They were launching a new series called Mountain Men, a documentary-style show spotlighting individuals who lived off the grid in the harshest environments of North America. What they needed weren't actors or survivalists playing a part. They wanted the real thing. And Tom Oar, tucked away in the snow-covered wilds of Montana, was the genuine article. Reluctant at first, Tom hesitated to let anyone film his life. He wasn't interested in fame, he didn't crave validation. But after some careful discussion and with Nancy's support, he agreed, on one condition: that everything shown was authentic. There would be no scripts, no embellishments, just the raw truth of daily survival. And so, with camera crews trailing his every movement, Tom Oar unknowingly stepped into the public eye. From the very first episode, viewers were captivated. Here was a man who could track an elk across frozen terrain, tan a hide using smoke and instinct, and smile softly while explaining how to survive a -30 degrees Fahrenheit winter without flinching. His calm demeanor, weathered face and unshakable presence stood in stark contrast to the modern world's constant noise. Tom wasn't trying to entertain. He was simply being himself, and that honesty became magnetic. Fan mail began pouring in. Strangers stopped him in town. Some sent gifts, while others confessed how Tom's lifestyle inspired them to simplify their own lives. People admired his independence, his skills, his quiet love for the land, and perhaps most of all his humility. Unlike many reality stars, Tom never played up for the camera. He didn't force drama or pretend to be someone he wasn't. He didn't even watch most of the episodes he was in. And as the show's popularity grew, so did the pressure. What had started as a small peek into his world was quickly becoming a spotlight that never dimmed. The attention wasn't just flattering, it was intrusive. Visitors began showing up uninvited. Journalists called for interviews. The simple solitude Tom had once fought so hard to achieve now came with strings attached. And though he greeted every fan with warmth, a quiet discomfort began to take root. He wasn't just the man in the mountains anymore. He was a symbol, a celebrity, a brand, and that realization began to chip away at the peace he had spent decades building. For decades, Tom Oar had endured what few could even imagine: bucking broncos, sub-zero blizzards, grizzly bear territory, and years of rugged mountain labor that tested every inch of his body. But in the bitter depths of one Montana winter, it wasn't a bull or a bear that brought him to his knees. It was a quiet, ordinary task that ended in disaster. Snow had built up heavily on the roof of Tom's remote cabin, and despite Nancy's warnings to wait or ask for help, Tom, stubborn, proud, and fiercely independent, grabbed a ladder and climbed up with a shovel in hand. It was something he'd done many times before, but this time was different. Whether it was a patch of hidden ice, or a shift in the old roof structure, Tom lost his footing. He fell from the top of the cabin and slammed into the frozen ground below, landing hard on his back and side. The air was knocked from his lungs. For several agonizing moments, he couldn't move. Nancy rushed outside after hearing the thud, and what she found would change everything. Tom, groaning in pain, insisted he was fine, but the bruising, shallow breaths and stiffness in his body told a different story. With no ambulance nearby and no fast way to reach a hospital, Nancy wrapped him in blankets and kept watch as his condition worsened. Eventually they made the journey to a clinic, where doctors confirmed his injuries: cracked ribs and multiple broken bones. Though not life-threatening, they required weeks of rest and recovery, an impossible ask for a man who lived by the grind of daily survival. But the injury went deeper than bones. For the first time in his life, Tom Oar felt doubt creeping in. The man who had once danced with death in rodeo arenas and tracked elk through waist-deep snow was now afraid to climb a ladder. Simple chores that once came naturally were suddenly unbearable. And more than the physical toll, the fall had shaken the core of his confidence. The wilderness, which had once been his sanctuary, now posed a mortal risk. Tom began to question whether staying there was worth the danger, not just to himself, but to Nancy, who had always stood by him. What if she wasn't there next time? What if help never came? The incident, while quietly endured, marked a decisive moment. Something had broken that day on the frozen ground, and it wasn't just Tom's ribs. It was the illusion of invincibility, and from that moment on, the countdown to a life-altering decision had begun. After nearly 4 decades of living on his own terms, deep in the forests of Montana, Tom Oar found himself at a crossroads he had long tried to ignore. The accident on the roof wasn't just a fall, it was a wake-up call. The simple, quiet life he had carved out with Nancy in one of the most unforgiving parts of the country had always come with danger, but now the stakes had shifted. Each winter brought colder winds, heavier snow, and a body that no longer healed like it used to. For the first time, Tom couldn't pretend that everything was still under control. The questions that once sat quietly in the background now demanded answers. What if he fell again? What if Nancy too became vulnerable, and there was no one around to help? Their closest neighbors were miles away. A hospital was a journey of hours, not minutes. There were no children nearby to lean on, no backup plan, no safety net. It wasn't just about Tom's survival anymore. It was about Nancy's well-being too. She had weathered the same storms, stood by him through every hardship, and deserved more than a life shadowed by what-ifs. The decision didn't come easily. For Tom, the wilderness wasn't just a home, it was a religion. It was where he found meaning, purpose, and a connection to the earth that no city or town could replicate. Every tree held a memory. Every snowfall reminded him of a season conquered. But eventually, even legends must listen to reason. Quietly, without ceremony, Tom and Nancy began to pack up their lives. After season 9 of Mountain Men, observant viewers noticed his appearances had grown scarce. There were no public announcements, no dramatic farewells, just a fading presence that left fans confused and worried. In truth, Tom was recovering both physically and emotionally, and slowly stepping away from the very world he had helped popularize. He and Nancy made the hardest decision of all, to leave the mountains. They relocated to Florida, a place warmer, flatter, and closer to family. No more icy roofs to shovel, no more days spent chopping firewood just to keep warm. For many, it was a logical move. But for Tom, it felt like a funeral for a part of himself. The man who once thrived in the wild was now learning how to exist in a world that moved at a softer, slower pace. He didn't see it as surrender, he saw it as survival. But even so, the pain of goodbye lingered like frost on the edge of spring. In the warmth of Florida's gentle breezes, far removed from the crackling firewood and icy silence of the Montana wilderness, Tom Oar began the most unexpected chapter of his life. A chapter defined not by survival, but by stillness. It was a place of palm trees and paved roads, a world that moved slower in temperature but faster in pace. And for a man who had spent over 40 years battling snowdrifts and sharpening blades by hand, it was disorienting. Tom still worked with his hands, crafting knives, shaping leather, and making small items to sell at local fairs, but the urgency that once defined his days was gone. There were no wolves to track, no storms to prepare for, no traps to set before sundown. At first, the simplicity was a relief. His body no longer ached from chopping wood and freezing winds, and Nancy no longer had to worry about what lurked outside their door. But as the days turned into months, something else began to stir within Tom, a subtle, persistent longing for the rhythm of the life he'd left behind. He'd wake up to the sound of traffic and remember the howls of coyotes. He'd watch the sunset over palm-lined streets and miss the snow-tipped peaks of the Yak Valley. And though he rarely said it out loud, those close to him could see the shift. The mountain man hadn't left the mountains. The mountains had been etched into his soul. Nancy, ever his steadfast partner, remained his anchor in this new terrain. She took on the role of nurturer and companion, tending to Tom's needs and keeping their small routines alive. They still visited local crafting shows and sold handmade goods, smiling at strangers who had no idea the quiet man before them had once been a national television icon. But the change ran deeper than location. Tom wasn't just adapting to a new environment, he was grappling with an identity shift. For decades, he had lived with clear purpose. Every day in Montana was a mission: to survive, to thrive, to build. In Florida, time moved gently, and for a man used to battling nature, that gentleness felt hollow. Fame had followed him. Even here, people still recognized him, still sent letters, still asked about mountain men. But Tom had never chased celebrity. In fact, he had recoiled from it.
He didn't enjoy being seen as a star.
He didn't re-watch his episodes or bask in praise. What he valued wasn't attention, but authenticity. And in the quiet heat of Florida, he found himself staring inward, remembering not just the life he once lived, but the man he was when he lived it. As Tom Oar quietly adjusted to life far from the mountain slopes that once defined him, the outside world refused to let him disappear in peace. Whispers turned into speculation, and speculation quickly spiraled into full-blown rumor. In 2020, the internet was blindsided by a chilling piece of misinformation. A detailed obituary falsely claiming Tom had passed away. It wasn't just a vague social media post, it read like an official tribute, complete with life history, location, and cause of death. Within hours, it spread like wildfire across fan pages, message boards, and even small news outlets. The reaction was instant and emotional. Tributes poured in from fans who had watched him brave snowstorms, craft by hand, and live with a kind of purpose that few dared to replicate. People grieved, some lit candles, others shared personal stories about how Tom had changed the way they viewed the world. The problem? None of it was true. Tom Oar was alive, older, quieter, but still breathing. The fake obituary wasn't just misinformation. It was a cruel reminder of how quickly fiction becomes accepted truth in the digital age. And it didn't help that around the same time, Tom's appearances on Mountain Men had diminished significantly. Viewers were already suspicious, already asking why the fan favorite had seemingly faded without explanation. The mystery deepened when, in season 11, Tom suffered a real medical emergency, severe breathing issues that struck in the dead of night. The episode revealed what many feared: Tom's heart was weakening, and fluid had begun to build in his lungs. It was a terrifying moment, captured on camera, that showed just how fragile the Mountain Man had become. Although he recovered and continued to live more quietly, the scare gave new fuel to the death rumors. By 2024, the speculation returned with force. Some outlets even claimed Tom had died peacefully in Lakeland, Florida at the age of 81, citing anonymous sources and offering no real verification. Fans were caught between confusion and concern. Was it true this time? Had the legend finally fallen for real? Yet again, no official confirmation came, because Tom, incredibly, was still alive. Now in his early 80s, he continued to live privately, refusing to play into the spectacle. He wasn't posting online. He wasn't granting interviews. But those close to him, and a few trusted sources, confirmed what many hoped was true. Tom Oar was still here, quietly holding on to life, even as the world around him tried to write the final chapter too soon. In a world that glorifies convenience and chases instant gratification, Tom Oar stands as a haunting, humbling reminder of what it truly means to live with purpose. At 82 years old, he may no longer trek through deep snowdrifts or haul firewood up a mountainside, but the essence of the mountain still lives within him, in his calloused hands, in the quiet pride of a well-crafted blade, and in the stories he tells when the cameras are gone. Unlike many reality stars who leverage fame into brand deals, YouTube channels, or spin-offs, Tom simply walked away, not in defeat but in quiet triumph. He had nothing left to prove. His decision to retreat from public life was not about running from attention, but about returning to something more sacred: peace. He now spends his days in Florida's warmth, still making knives, still tanning leather, still teaching anyone who genuinely wants to learn the ancient ways. But his voice, while calm and modest, speaks volumes about endurance, resilience, and the dignity of living life on your own terms. Friends say his eyes still light up when he talks about Montana, not about the show, not about the fame, but about the land, the silence, the struggle. He speaks of blizzards survived, of bear tracks outside the cabin, of the joy in watching smoke curl from a freshly tanned hide. These memories are not just recollections, they are anchors to a life that shaped him more than any spotlight ever could. And when asked if he regrets leaving the wilderness, Tom never hesitates. Not a thing, he says, because for Tom, the mountain wasn't just a place. It was a teacher, a mirror, a crucible. It tested him, broke him, rebuilt him, and gave him the kind of satisfaction no amount of money or recognition could replace. He may not live under the stars anymore, but the lessons of the land have never left him. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Tom Oar: not the television fame or the handcrafted moccasins, but the reminder that true freedom doesn't come from detachment. It comes from devotion. Devotion to nature, to craft, to simplicity, and most of all, to living a life so real, it echoes long after the cameras stop rolling. Tom Oar is still alive, but more importantly, the spirit of what he stood for is alive in every person who chooses substance over spectacle, and silence over noise. The Mountain Man may have stepped off the mountain, but his legend keeps climbing.